There's a group of us here in Knowlton at Bishop's University reading River Thieves. We've been taking a look at it for the last 2 to 3 weeks. Can you tell us something about where that story for you came from? What inspired you? What had it been lurking in your imagination for some time, or was this something that had a particular trigger moment that got you into it?
Yeah, it wasn't lurking in terms of like lurking as a story that I thought could be a novel for a long time or anything like that. I grew up in Buckins, which is 5 minutes from Red Indian Lake, which was kind of the last bastion or the last safe place for the Beothuk. I used to go to the Shanadiddy snack bar at the food center all the time. And this, in a very bizarre way, that story was all around me as I grew up. And I think everybody in Newfoundland grows up with the story of the Beothuk in one way or another. I have no idea why in my mid-30s I woke up one morning and thought, oh, I think that could be a novel. I'd been writing short stories for a while by then. I'd published a book of short stories. And people would say, when are you going to write a novel? And I'd say, as soon as I have an idea that I think would be more than 12 pages without boring the hell out of me. And I had never had one. And it literally was like I woke up one morning and thought, I think there's something in there that I can work with that would be, that could be a novel. And it was an interesting process because first of all, I thought I knew the story of the Beothuk, and of course I had no idea. And the story that I had grown up with, and that I think Newfoundlanders are still growing up with, and in the few people outside of Newfoundland who hear it, in many ways still hear, is what's now some people call the atrocity myth. And I think to say myth is maybe too strong a word, but I grew up with this notion that the Beothuk were a huge group of people, somewhere around 50,000 at the time of first contact. Nobody knows where that number came from now. Somebody printed it once, and it just got repeated. And that they're extinct now because more or less they were hunted down and slaughtered like animals in huge numbers. There's no truth to any of that whatsoever. But that's the story that I and everyone I knew grew up with. I mean, Harold Horwood, shortly after Newfoundland joined Canada, printed an article in Maclean's as a way of introducing Newfoundland to the rest of Canada.
The rest of Canada, yes.
It was called The People Who Were Killed for Fun, in which he repeated all of these apocryphal stories about the Beothuk being sort of herded into the ocean from beaches in the hundreds and being slaughtered there. I mean, nobody knows why those were the stories we had when they're so completely, there's absolutely nothing.
Your novel presents Governor Duckworth and David Buchan as very active in making contact and attempting to reach some sort of accommodation and understanding.
Well, the actual story, at least as far as we can piece it together, is that at the time of first contact, the Beothuk were a very small group of people. There's no way to peg it with any certainty, but archaeologists, anthropologists, using the same kind of measures that they've used to say that the indigenous and populations of North and South America were actually way higher than people used to believe. Using those same kind of measures, they say that the population at the time of first contact couldn't have been smaller than 500 and couldn't have been higher than 5,000. So somewhere in there. The best guess most people think is around 2,500 people, so a very small group of people. And they were incredibly insular. Like, their response to the arrival of Europeans was just to withdraw. And eventually they ran out of, because it's an island, they ran out of places to withdraw to. And when the Europeans began settling the northeast coast and putting up dams and weirs on the salmon rivers, that's when most of the violence that there's any kind of corroboration for took place. And a lot of the violence can be traced to one particular man and the people who worked for him, and that was John Peyton
Sr. Yeah.
But John Peyton Jr. was involved in just about every attempt to establish some kind of friendly contact with the Beothuk, most of which happened once the Europeans began to realize that they were in big trouble. So too late.
Too late.
But when I started doing the research for the book, it was that relationship, those two men who had grown up in the same house, who had very different, like polar opposite approaches when it came to the Beothuk, that I sort of latched onto and started asking the questions that historians can't answer and that novelists have the opportunity to play with, like what could have led to that? What might explain that difference?
And you introduced the character of Cassie, or Cassandra, which I think, reading the book, was a brilliant move because it put another dimension to the whole story. Did you have a particular intention when you introduced her into the story? I think you've mentioned elsewhere that there was a soap operatic element in the story. Was that to sort of sweeten the narrative in some way? Although it's not that sweet, is it?
No, it's not sweet at all. And in fact, quite the opposite. There were two things happening there. One is that one of the biggest influences on me at that point was Cormac McCarthy, who I think is a genius, like just one of the best prose writers I've ever encountered. But there are no women in that man's books. Even when he has women in his books, they're not real. Like, it's an incredible blind spot for somebody of that caliber. And I made up my mind before I started River Thieves, I was not going to write a book without women. And there's very few women available in the material, like in the source material. Most of the people who had settled Newfoundland at the time, the Europeans who get mentioned, are men. And I was determined to find a way to have a woman at the center of that story. That's one thing. The second thing was that I decided very early on that I was not going to write a book about the Beothuk. There have been a number of books written from the perspective of the Beothuk, like trying to guess at what, or trying to imagine what they must have felt about what was happening to them. And I always hated those books. It felt to me completely wrong-headed. I mean, to me, extinction means we will never know who they are, and we will never know, or even be able to guess, what they thought about what was happening. So to pretend that we can is one more thing we can do to them. So what I decided at the outset was that the story of the Beothuk was going to be something that happened in the margins of the novel, in the same way that it happened in the margins of what was happening in Newfoundland. Like Duckworth was interested, Buchan was interested, but most people, it didn't even enter their consciousness. So I knew that that story was going to happen in the shadows. So what I had to try and do was to write a story involving the European characters that in some ways occupied the same emotional territory. And Cassie was that place for me. What she experiences as a young girl, I was trying to find a betrayal that that seemed to occupy some of the same registers.
Yes.
And her response to that betrayal, of course, is to withdraw. Withdraw. To a place where she felt she was safe, which in the end ends up being the least safe place for her. In, again, mirroring what seems to have happened.
But in the very end, she seems to be walking into the woods.
She gets out, right? She does. But, I mean, the other thing that I was absolutely not going to do was to provide some kind of happy ending for anyone. I think a lot of people wanted John Peyton Jr. to marry Cassie.
We did notice this as a group of readers, that we don't get that.
Yeah, and the very, very last thing I was going to do was to write a book exploring that incredibly tragic historical reality, and to use it as a way for a couple of European white characters to learn something about themselves and to live happily ever after. So I knew that at the end that Cassie was going to walk away from those men. And whether or not that means she ends up somewhere better, I don't know. But I knew that there was not going to be some kind of object lesson for the Paytons there that would allow them to...
Nothing too pat and tidy and sweet.
Yeah.
The book is very, very physical in the action, in what people are doing and how they're working their way up that river, through the forest, the action that take place on the sea. It's a very, very physical book. Have you trekked into Newfoundland? Have you done that sort of thing? Have you ever skinned a fox? Because there's an amazing paragraph in which a fox is skinned in a very detailed way.
Yeah. No, I've never done any of that.
Never done any of that?
And in fact, I wouldn't last a night out in the woods. Michael Winter would do okay for a night or two, but I would be completely lost. There's a very interesting, I think one of the things that was going on there was the influence of McCarthy and his ability to create that sense of the physical world and people moving through the physical world, which I have since learned he more or less stole from Faulkner. I hadn't read any Faulkner at the time, but I remember reading a couple of Faulkner books where like they felt like they were lifted directly out of a McCarthy novel, but of course it was
the other way around.
Yeah. So that was one thing, and I was wanting to recreate that sense of people in the physical world and what that might be like. But of course I had very little direct experience to draw on. I knew the world. Right, I knew Newfoundland, and I knew Labrador, which was probably closer to what Newfoundland was like at that time, when they were going through what they called a mini ice age, where it was much colder and much more difficult living conditions. But I think the thing, my way of talking about that I remember hearing an interview with a mystery writer, and I wish I could remember his name because I've been quoting him for years on this. But the interviewer said, you know, I'm fascinated by how much you know and how do you know so much about all of these things that your characters do? And he said, well, you know, if I'm writing a scene where someone is picking a lock, I don't need to know how to pick a lock. I need to know enough about picking a lock to make the reader think the character knows how to pick a lock. So, and that has been my way of working my entire life, I think, as a writer. So in this book, for example, David Buchan as a young boy, ends up in the Navy. And of course, when I started to write about that, I knew nothing about the Royal Navy. So I went to the library. This was pre-internet days. I went to the library. I came home with a stack of 10 or 12 books on the Royal Navy. 50 pages into the first book, I had everything I needed, because I just needed a handful of details that could make that feel real. So I didn't read any further. That was as far as I took it.
You'd found your vocabulary.
I'd found a couple of telling details that I thought would allow me to make that world feel real on the page, and that was as much as I need.
There are a number of journeys up the Exploits River, or River of Exploits. Actually 4 if you count the Miller trip up.
Right.
Were you in any way, did you have in mind, I'm not saying inspired, but did you have in mind Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a book which you probably would have studied in an early English course at Memorial University?
No.
No?
No. And in fact, I was quite surprised when people started drawing that comparison, just because I hadn't thought of it. But of course, in hindsight, it's pretty obvious. But I wasn't consciously thinking of that at all. The trips up the river became a kind of organizing principle for the book, because I had never tried to write a novel before. I did not have a clue what I was doing, and was mired for a long time. And also I was trying to figure out, how do I deal with historical characters and events combined with things that are completely made up, characters that did not exist, events that I'm just creating in order to make an arc that works as an aesthetic whole. So what I decided to do was to use those 3 trips up the river as the spine of the book. And I decided I would not do anything to alter what happened on those trips from the historical record. So for example, John Peyton Jr. is on that first trip up the river in the novel. Historically, that's completely false. He was actually still in England at the time. But in order for the book to work as a novel, he had to be on all of those trips. What I decided was, if I make a decision to put someone like John Peyton Jr. in a position where he was not historically, I was not going to allow anything he did or said to alter what has been reported about those trips and how it unfolded. So that became my line in the sand, right? I could change anything else to make the books work as a novel, to make the story work as a novel. But those trips down the river were going to be as close to the historical record as I could make them.